At the height of the golden age of piracy, nobody on Earth was as despised by the law as captains of pirate ships. Piracy had become so prolific that governments were willing to go to extreme methods to track down and execute the most infamous offenders, making a brutal example of them by executing them in wild and bizarre ways. Some of these executions were made to be as public and as violent as possible in order to deter future pirates from committing similar offences, lest they find themselves in the same terrible situation. Perhaps no torture method intended for those found guilty of acts of piracy was quite as unpleasant as drying in the sun, a rarely used and particularly cruel method of disposing of a criminal. It sounds intimidating enough just from the name, but what was this torture method? Who was it reserved for, and why? These are all questions that will be tackled in today's video as we explore the brutal reality of this terrifying method of torture reserved for some of the highest status pirates of the Golden Age. How did drying in the sun work? Firstly, you might be surprised to learn that more often than not, drying in the sun took place after a pirate had been executed. It was used as a deterrent to sailors who might consider taking up the pirate's life, and was an effective one at that. One of the only known recorded examples of drying in the sun was carried out on none other than Jack Rackham, otherwise known as the pirate Captain Calico Jack. Rackham was a pirate from England who, in the years spanning 1718 to 1720, commanded a successful crew of plunderers around the waters off the coast of the Bahamas. He was well renowned for his expensive taste in clothing, his cunning charisma, and the fact that he closely worked with two female pirates, Mary Read and his would-be wife Anne Bonny. On board his largest and most well-known ship, the Kingston, Rackham marauded his way through Jamaica, Cuba, and the surrounding islands, making a name and fortune for himself. Unfortunately for him, it wasn't to last. In the October of 1720, Rackham and his crew had been sailing to Negril, a beach area around the west coast of Jamaica. On the way, they fired a gun for reasons unclear. This caught the attention of none other than another pirate, Jean Bonadvis, who was sailing in the immediate vicinity with his crew on board his sloop. Bonadvis had been commissioned by Woodes Rogers, the Bahamian governor, to bring Rackham and his crew to justice, and this is exactly what they intended to do. With the help of Jonathan Barnett, a renowned and feared pirate hunter, Bonadvis and his men fired their swivel guns at the cornered pirate captain, which, combined with a broadside shot, rendered Rackham's ship unusable. Barnett and Bonadvis brought Rackham and his pirates ashore, where military officers made a formal arrest. Later that year, Rackham and the key players in his crew were tried and found guilty of piracy. But for Rackham himself, a much grislier fate awaited his desecrated corpse once the executioner was done with him. Rackham lived out his final days in Spanish Town, Jamaica. He was not returned to England to face the horrors of Executioner's Dock. Jamaica would be his final resting place. In the November of 1720, Calico Jack Rackham met his doom at the end of the rope, alongside several other crew members who had garnered up a reputation of becoming feared and wanted pirates. His fellow men were removed from the gallows and disposed of, possibly buried. Rackham, however, was to be used as a tool, a deterrent to ensure nobody would want to meet the same fate as him. Ironically, there was very little dry about what came next. Calico Jack's body was removed from the gallows and placed in the back of a cart bound for an area known as Dead Men's Cay near the entrance of Port Royal. Here, he was likely placed in a boat, and his lifeless remains were rowed out to the jagged rocks surrounding the nearby islands. Here on the rocky shorelines of Dead Man's Cay, with the waves lapping at the coast and seabirds screaming overhead, Rackham was placed inside a gibbet, a brutal method of pirate torture on its own elsewhere in the world. The gibbet was a suspended cage big enough only to house the body of a condemned criminal, and all the horrors that came within the following weeks after housing it. Exposed to the sun, waves, and rocks, Rackham's body would have been damaged beyond belief shortly after his time in the gibbet. The parts of his body exposed to the sun would have become cracked and burned in the tropical heat. Below the water, waterlogging would eventually take over as his body became contorted and bloated. As the cage bashed against the rocks, the body would become bruised and scarred, all the while aquatic scavengers and seabirds plucked flesh from his bones. As you can imagine, it was a spectacularly undignifying way to be remembered. All of this would have taken place at the entrance to a very busy port, so onlookers could easily see the horrors unfolding before them. It was a clear message. The pirate's life would come with consequences. There are actually reports of drying in the sun taking place while the pirate within the gibbet was still alive. In these cases, the punishment would be an automatic death sentence with no hangman needed. Deprived of food and water, faced with the ever-present threat of keeping your head above water at high tide, and forced to face the merciless power of the tropical sun, pirates faced with drying would not be long for this world. Of all the ways the government and navy dealt with the threat of pirates, perhaps this was the absolute worst of the worst. The Dreaded Gibbet. The gibbets used when drying pirates in the sun were in fact a type of torture method all on their own and have been used commonly throughout the course of history's darker moments of legality and order. A typical gibbet would be vaguely body-shaped. Sometimes it would encapsulate the whole offender, other times it would allow the offender to sit and have their legs drop through the bottom. On other occasions, it was nothing more than a small hanging cage that would stuff the defenseless criminal into an incredibly strenuous position. A gibbet's primary purpose was to deter. In times gone by, gibbets containing the dead or dying bodies of criminals would be displayed at intentionally public places to put people off committing similar crimes to the victim lying or hanging before them. It was a common sentence issued around the 1700s, particularly reserved for murderers, pirates, highwaymen, or people who had committed acts of treason against a ruler or government. Whilst the gibbet reached the prime popularity around the time of the golden age of piracy came to light, it was no new invention. Monarchs and parliaments had been gibbeting their offenders since medieval times, with King Edward II of England famously disposing of his enemies' bodies in the 1300s by gibbeting them on a public road. The enemies in question, Henry of Montfort and Henry of Wellington, were hung and drawn prior to their gibbeting on show for all to see. In Edward II's case, the people that saw their remains didn't take it well. Instead, they protested and rioted at the spot in which their bodies were displayed, turning the corpses into relics out of disdain for the king. Moreover, gibbeted bodies were often seen as a danger to public health, especially when displayed so close to public areas. Bodies were often gibbeted for long periods of time, leading to disease spread from rotting flesh and the attraction of vermin such as rodents and insects to the area. In some extreme scenarios, bodies would be left in a gibbet until their clothes or even flesh had rotted. Upon these circumstances, the bones would then be removed and buried or scattered. Some cases of gibbeting were preceded by the body being dismembered to better fit within the confines of a smaller gibbet. Fresh bodies would likely have attracted large crowds of tourists, especially when high-status criminals were involved. Similar to the way executions were public spectacles, so too would have been the gibbets containing their remains. Surely, to a modern viewer, such a spectacle would have been the stuff of nightmares. Gibbeting remarkably goes back as far as biblical times and is mentioned in both the Old Testament and the Torah, where bodies were hung in cages suspended from trees. This carried through well into Roman times, used both by the Romans themselves and their enemies against them. This being said, the practice became much more common in the 17th and 18th centuries, specifically in British colonial areas. The last known instance of a gibbeting took place in Afghanistan in January of 1921. This was recorded in that month's issue of National Geographic, where photographs of gibbets were included that were said to still be in use at the time of the magazine's publication. These particular gibbets were reported to be specifically for criminals that were still alive. They would be removed from the site several months after their passing. Marooning. It wasn't just the men of the law that had their ways of exposing criminals to the elements to inflict a slow and terrifying death. The pirates themselves had a method called marooning. You may have heard us mention this punishment on the channel before, and with good reason. It was one of the most common ways that a disgruntled or mutinous pirate crew would deal with their treacherous or unfit captains. To maroon somebody, essentially, is to abandon them on an uninhabited island from which escape is impossible, or at least near impossible. The word descends from the term maroon, meaning an escaped slave who is on the run from his or her captors. When a pirate captain was marooned, he would typically be confronted by his furious crew, who would present him with the news of what was about to happen. At gun or knife point, he would be ejected from his ship, which would be turned over to a newly elected captain to take his place. The crew would sail to a remote island or island chain far enough from any others to ensure that escape was not on the cards. The ex-captain would be abandoned on the deserted island with a pathetic set of supplies: a serving of food, a container of water, possibly a small bottle of rum, and a pistol loaded with a single bullet. The food and water were intended to be consumed if the pirate desired to make an often futile attempt at survival whilst marooned, whereas the gun was offered as a way out, so to speak, if the pirate desired a quick death. Once a pirate was marooned, there was little chance of making it out alive. Intentionally abandoned in an area with no maritime traffic, the pirate's only hopes were to either swim to safety, attempt to find a means of sustaining himself on the deserted island, or to desperately attempt to signal passing vessels. Should the pirate fail to find a safe means of escape in time, several risks presented themselves. Before too long, the tide would come in, sweeping the pirate away from the island and into the sea beyond. Without a raft, this was often a death sentence. Choppy seas, the risk of drowning, and even passing sharks mistaking the thrashing body for prey were all grave possibilities. If the island was big enough, the pirate would be able to scramble to higher ground where the tide was not a risk, but he then would have faced the threat of the sun. Exposure to the elements in the tropical heat of the Caribbean would have been lethal in a matter of days, especially without food and water. All in all, it was a pretty terrible way for a pirate to go. Perhaps worse than the executioner's noose in some cases when you take the speed of the death into consideration. Marooning was so prolific in the golden age of piracy that pirates were referred to as marooners by sailors, civilians, and the navy. The pirates, however, had their own satirical term for the practice: to make a man the governor of his own island. The most famous case of a pirate escaping the horrors of marooning can be seen in Edward England, an Irish pirate captain who was marooned on Mauritius in 1720. It took 4 months of hard survival for him and several other men to escape, building a makeshift boat and sailing safely to Madagascar. Unfortunately, despite defying all odds, he would go on to die from disease that very same year. So that's a rundown of drying in the sun and other horrific pirate torture methods that involved exposure to the harsh elements of the Caribbean sun, waves, and wind. When the Golden Age came to a close, many of these punishments fell out of practice as the seas became more regulated and lawful. Unlike its many representations in the media, the pirate life was much more risk than reward once the government started to clamp down on crews in the Golden Age, and many pirates faced the terrors of the Dreaded Gibbet suspended over the very oceans they once called home. Thank you for watching this episode of Walk the Plank. Please do subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Have a great week. Cheers.